What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. It's pretty common for fans to look at certain lines of Pokemon and speculate at what their fate might have almost been. Was Volcarona supposed to be a legend? Were the elemental monkeys really going to be starters? But one of the most prevalent considerations is that of the Pseudo-Legendary. It's all too easy to look at a random 3-stage line and think, well, how come this one doesn't get to be called that, but others do? And you can see the logic. I mean, there are 3 different stages of the family that all flow in design, but there's more to it than that. Because to get the moniker of Pseudo-Legendary, these Pokemon require very specific stats, with the base stage having 300 or 320, or if you're a Dreepy then 270 for some reason. The middle evolutions have a solid 410 to 420 in their base stat totals, although again, Sliggoo randomly has 452 instead. Don't know why that one's so much stronger than all the rest of them, but in their final stages, each of these Pokemon have 600 points in their base stats, which really is the defining trait of a Pseudo-Legendary, even more so than the Dragon typing. So that's why the famous example of Haxorus is not a Pseudo-Legendary, because even though the line has 3 forms and the first 2 line up perfectly with those numbers, the final dragon falls short of 600 by 60 points. And I mean, really, it shouldn't be all that hard to squeeze 60 more points into somewhere that wouldn't overpower it, like maybe a little in HP and its specials, I guess. But we're not here to change Pokemon stats. In fact, the opposite. We're going to find new potential pseudo-legends based on their stats matching up, and then maybe say give them a new evolution or 2 to make it work. Sort of like what they did with Annihilate. Honestly, Mankey and Primeape are right about the range of what a pseudo-legend stats should be for the first 2 stages, but unfortunately the Paldean edition didn't quite make it up to 600. So that will be our line of thinking. And just because it hasn't happened before doesn't mean it never will. After all, Eevee was never an official starter for the player to use until suddenly it was. So I could totally see a future cross-generational evolution joining the ranks of the pseudo-legendary crowd. Now, when looking at Pokemon that could obtain this title, we of course have to consider only single or 2-stage lines, because while, say, Jigglypuff and Wigglytuff could also fall into the range to get a new final evolution at 600, they've already got a baby form on the other end, and 4-stage lines just don't exist yet, so our first real lead in this exercise is the Venonat family. The little fuzzball falls squarely between the standard numbers of pseudo-base stages, and while Venomoth is on the high end, closer to Sliggoo than the rest of them, it could still behave as a middle evolution before gaining a new final form. What that form could be might vary, probably not just a bigger moth, maybe something more like Buzzswole perhaps. But it would be pretty cool to get a poison-type pseudo-legendary, honestly, giving us a taste of something unique. Another Gen 1 line that was close is the Horsey family, but again, despite Kingdra becoming a dragon, it didn't quite grow strong enough. However, their Dex neighbors, Goldeen and Seaking, still could qualify. Again, they are on the upper end of the stat pool for their stages, but they do fall in that range. So if they just had another evolution beyond Seaking to reach 600 points, that would make them equal to Dragonite, which is crazy. Although it can't just grow to be a bigger fish because that would be pretty boring, so maybe another surprise Sea Serpent glow-up could work to make the Goldeen line notable after all these years. I was also surprised that the Wingull family falls into a similar boat, with Wingull just barely matching the minimum where Dreepy is, while Pelipper is closer to the outlier of the middle stages, but they could still see another water and flying type tacked onto the end someday. There are other waterfowl out there after all to base it on, or it could just change types altogether like some of the other pseudo-legends do. But since they are both on the extremes, I think it would be fine for their claim to fame remaining the Zubats of the ocean. Or would that be Tentacool, I guess. Anyway, ones that line up much better are the Snubbull line. These foreshadowing fairies start out at a cool 300, just like the standard, and then Granbull winds up below the upper threshold as well, so they could easily come up with a 3rd member of the family to get up to 600 upon evolving. It wouldn't even be that hard to imagine what an evolution could be with all sorts of canine inspirations, and I could see it working on either 2 or 4 legs as well, and I think we would all just be happy to have another strong physically attacking fairy. On the opposite end of the animal kingdom, we have Glameow and Purugly, who would also be perfect for this. Glameow is at a solid 310, while its evolution has the same number as the top range for the mid-level Pokémon in this group, so likewise, they could have a new evolution someday to reach 600 and become a new pseudo-legend as well, preferably in the same region that Snubbull gets one so that they can play off of each other in a rivalry. And let me tell you something, there is no shortage of big cats that they could use for inspiration. But I do worry that keeping them as pure normal types might be a bit too boring for people, so you could add in a new type to spice things up if you wanted. However, two-stage lines are not the only prospects that we have here, because certain Pokémon are in the Goldilocks zone but have no relations at all. Like, for instance, somehow Pyukumuku has just the right number to be a pseudo-legend, but unfortunately it's the middle number. Yeah, this sea cucumber is somehow just as strong as a Svilis or a Hakamoa, although it's mostly in its defenses, so maybe saying strong isn't the right word. But the problem is that Pyukumuku doesn't really seem capable of coming from something else. It's got base stage written all over it. So instead, what about a Chatot? It's only got one more point in its base stats, however, it's not nearly as specialized as Pyukumuku, so it doesn't really excel in any one area, meaning that it could actually use an evolution to get up to snuff. However, that would mean that Chatot would need the Roselia treatment to get a pre-evolution at the same time, which is doable, but it's not like this parrot is huge or anything, so if it were going to evolve from something, it would probably have to be like a half-egg sort of thing. So I guess like a new Togepi of sorts. But then Chatot could turn into a massive songbird that completely leans into the music and sound aspects of its design, and that would actually be an exciting use of the normal typing for a pseudo-legendary for once. So it's probably not the first thing that you think of when you look at Chatot of all Pokémon, but if they ever decided they were bored enough, they could turn this bird into the newest powerhouse, and it would honestly be relatively simple. Now, another one-off Pokémon that could work is Wishiwashi. Kind of. Its schooling form is slightly over the 600 base stat total cap, and while you could say that's to make up for its solo form being so wimpy, it's a little too wimpy, being about half of what it should be for the base stage. So ideally, it could have worked more like Zygarde with different forms, based on how many of them are gathered together. So they wouldn't be evolutions per se, but I think that form shifts like this would be a pretty cool new way to handle a pseudo-legendary that's never been done before. It could have the same restrictions as Wishiwashi's ability to make sure that it wouldn't reach its final form by the 3rd gym or anything. So if Wishiwashi had that 50% form that had the right stats, we could have seen our first water-type pseudo-legendary all the way back in Alola. However, we have an even better case for this sort of arrangement with Meltan. See, Meltan has the perfectly even 300 in its stats, while Melmetal goes all the way up to 600. So those are great bookends for a pseudo line, they're just missing out that in-between bridge. And while I've looked into squeezing middle evolutions into established lines before, it's not likely that they would actually do that. So maybe they could just downgrade the regular Melmetal to the 400s tier, and then have the Gigantamax form be the true ending. Although, these are actual legendary Pokémon, so they probably wouldn't appreciate the demotion. But it is a shame because we were so close on this one. And really, the Finizen family could be shuffled like this too, with the cute little guy being perfectly in line with the start, and shockingly, Palafin splits are really close as well, with the hero form actually being overqualified for this. The Dolphin line could have worked as a pseudo-legendary if only Palafin's normal look changed in the slightest instead of just being a copy and paste from the previous form. Okay, back to more reasonable options, we have Morlul and Shiinotic. These Pokémon are just a little below the average numbers where they should be, but they wouldn't be the lowest out of their contemporaries, and really their underwhelming status just kind of proves that they do need some kind of help. So why not have Shiinotic evolve into an even bigger mushroom creature? They could keep its creepiness factor if they wanted, but there are plenty of ideas they could go with for the mushrooms, or maybe they could even play off of its light theming a lot more. There could just be a lot of creativity here, and it would be interesting to have a Pokémon in this category that's more based on their defenses and tricks like status conditions. And this may be the only way that we could get a grass-type pseudo-legendary too. Now, the last two I think are some of the best potentials for this possibility in reality, starting with Bonsly. This fake little tree has 290 in its base stats, which is honestly not bad considering it's technically a baby Pokemon, and of course its evolution Sudowoodo has the ideal 410, so no wonder it was so strong when you first encounter it. That being said, I think the imitation tree has plenty of potential for an evolution, becoming a towering redwood of sorts, or any other form of an int would work, while still actually being a rock type. This wouldn't be the first rock type pseudo-legendary, but just imagine how annoyed Tyranitar would be if Sudowoodo somehow wormed his way into becoming his equal. That would just be so funny to me. And the final option in this scenario would of course be Meowth. Obviously, this is a popular Pokemon, being prominent since the very beginning, so it wouldn't be out of the question because we've already had so many modifications for the Scratch Cat over the years. But Meowth is only 10 points below the base, still above the lowest one, and then Persian has a 440 in its stats, which is still below the highest. So they are right in the sweet spot for fitting in here. But honestly, the main reason that this idea is so promising is because of how many different kinds of Meowth there have been. Not only would regular Persian get an evolution, but an Alolan variant could also exist, of course, on top of a Berserker evolution who also shares the same stat totals as the Persians. Granted, that would probably mean 2 new Pokemon, which means that this would in fact be the first branching evolution for a pseudo-legendary ever, not counting Hisui and Gudra because that's just a form change, so that alone might be worth the investment, basically getting 3 new pseudos for the price of 1, all because these popular Pokemon just so happen to have the right stats. Again, I don't really think that any of this is all that likely, but hey, you never know. We went generations without new evolutions until Scarlet and Violet brought them back in force, so there's always a slim chance that they could go all out in the future. And with pseudo-legendaries being so rare, usually only 1 per region, there are like 7 times as many actual legendary Pokemon. So I could see them wanting to fix that deficit eventually one day by going back to pick up at least 1 regular past Pokemon to give a little special sprucing up. So, what Pokemon would you promote to pseudo-legendary based on their stats? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded!